The people who watch this channel love videos with maps, and that's fine, because I also love videos with maps. If you've watched my Tour of Middle-earth videos, you'll know the maps I prefer to use. Today, we're not using that map. We're using a special map, one that was annotated by Pauline Baynes and Tolkien himself, and these annotations provide some interesting insights into Middle-earth that can't really be found anywhere else. In this video, we look at Tolkien's annotated map of Middle-earth. In the late 1960s, Tolkien and Pauline Baynes collaborated to make a poster map of Middle-earth. If you're unsure of who Pauline Baynes was, she was an English illustrator, author, and artist who worked extensively with both Tolkien and also C.S. Lewis. For Tolkien, she created artwork for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, as well as several of his smaller pieces. In 1968, she released this illustrated map of Middle-earth, which includes several unique features on the map, as well as drawings of famous places in Middle-earth. Ceren Amroth, the Doors of Durin, Hobbiton, the Barrow Downs, the Black Gate, the Argonath, Barad-dûr, Minas Tirith, Minas Morgul, and Mount Doom. Because Tolkien worked directly with Baynes, he was able to direct her illustrations of the map, as well as read her own suggestions for what could be included. Because emails didn't exist back then, this was all done on a physical map, and this map survived both Tolkien and Baynes, who passed away in 2008. This map was known about after Baynes' death, but it wasn't discovered until 2015, where it was found in a copy of Lord of the Rings that Baynes possessed. The annotations themselves are extremely difficult to read, but fortunately, they were transcribed by Blackwell's Rare Books later that same year. So firstly, you can see at the top who wrote the annotations. Baynes are in blue and Tolkien's are in green, and it's no surprise that most of the annotations were by Tolkien. Many of the annotations aren't really anything interesting. They either give names that we already know about, or they describe geographical features, mostly trees. However, there are some very interesting ones that give us some insight into how Tolkien actually envisioned Middle-earth, and some of these details we can't necessarily find in other places. One of the things you'll notice on the map are place names. Interestingly, many of these place names were new at the time: Erin Vaughan, the Undeeps, Ethelond, Londere, to name a few. Most of these places feature prominently in the lore and thus have reappeared over and over on later maps. However, there are a handful of places that appeared on this map for the first time, yet don't really make appearances on later maps either. These three places are Framsburg, Dorwinion, and Tumladen. Framsburg was the old capital of the Aethiode, and while Tolkien does describe where exactly it was located, he never actually places it on a map. For some reason, Framsburg doesn't really appear on later maps, probably because it was long ruined and irrelevant. Next up is Dorwinion, the mysterious wine-growing land that is mentioned in The Hobbit as being somewhere in the Wilderland, but its exact location is never described nor shown on any map apart from this one. Interestingly, on the non-transcribed version of the map, you can see the word Mildor, meaning land of wine, showing that Tolkien always associated the land with wine, even if the name was changed. The last location is Tumladen, not to be confused with the valley where the legendary city of Gondolin could be found. In Gondor, Tumladen was a valley in or next to Lossarnach, where most of the non-combatants from Minas Tirith and the surrounding lands were sent during the War of the Ring. Other geographical features that appear on this map, but not necessarily on other maps, are some extra forests. Tolkien shaded in forests at Erin Vaughan, a new invention at the time, but also through Enedwaith and Druaethiae. This is to bring these lands in line with descriptions that Tolkien recorded across his various works. We are told that Druaethiae was a wooded land, so this map adds some forests there. As for Enedwaith, it once contained great forests which were destroyed thanks to the Númenóreans and later Sauron. However, in the unfinished tales, Tolkien does mention that some forests in Enedwaith and Minhiriath had regrown by the end of the Third Age. Some other smaller annotations are those that describe where animals should be. At first glance, not particularly interesting, but when you think about it, they do provide some insight about certain places. One that isn't surprising is the placement of wolves in Eregion. Wolves were a constant problem in Eriador, and the Fellowship was attacked by wolves not far from Moria. One of Baynes' suggestions was black swans near to the Dead Marshes, but these weren't featured in the final map, and there's no mention of swans in the Dead Marshes when Frodo and Sam go through there. In the wide, empty lands between the Anduin and the Sea of Rhûn, Tolkien writes kine and horses. We know kine did exist, and were hunted down near to the Sea of Rhûn. As for horses, the men of Rhovanion, ancestors of the Rohirrim, who lived in these lands, were breeders of horses. While none of this is new information, it does tell us that these lands were probably steppe, flat grasslands. This explains why waves of Easterlings were able to pass through here. In Harad, Tolkien writes down elephants. We know about these, the Mumakil, but also camels. As far as I'm aware, camels are not mentioned anywhere else, but yeah, they did exist in Middle-earth, and it's probable that the Haradrim did use them. Next, we have a lot of information about boats. Near to the Grey Havens, Baynes and Tolkien wrote more or less the same thing, that the elven ships were small, white, or grey. Baynes writing that they were single-masted. This tells us that the elves didn't really build large boats or warships, or at the very least, the ships that sailed west across the open ocean or for leisure around the coastlines were quite small. Sure enough, illustrations of these small boats do appear on the map. Completely opposite of that is Baynes' description of the Númenórean ships, specifically those that brought Elendil and his two sons to Middle-earth. She writes that they could be as large as a galleon, with as many as 5 masts, basically as big a sailed ship as you can get. She also suggested that the ships would be black-sailed, which does match Tolkien's descriptions of later Númenórean ships, and that 7 of them would have a white star on the main sail. As far as I know, each of these 7 special ships would carry a palantir. I'm guessing the palantiri were carried on separate ships because A, some of them were very heavy, and B, so they wouldn't all be lost at once should a ship go down. Why these ships needed special sails is anyone's guess. These giant ships don't appear on the final map, but I think that's because Baynes ran out of space rather than Tolkien disagreeing with the description of the ships. We know that the Númenóreans built ships which were large enough for multi-year voyages, some even over a decade long. We also know that Ar-Pharazôn's flagship was called Alcarondas, the Castle of the Sea, so it must have been huge. So yeah, the Númenóreans were building some pretty massive ships towards the end. But wait, there's more about ships. Tolkien also wrote down that he wanted drawings of both Gondorian and Corsair ships, anywhere between single to 3-masted. This may imply that after Númenor the art of shipbuilding declined because the size of the ships diminished, or that the Gondorians and Corsairs did not see the need for massive ships because they weren't really sailing beyond the coasts. The Gondorian ships are described as black and silver, probably with a white star or the white tree to differentiate them from the Corsair ships. Speaking of the Corsair ships, their description is interesting. The Corsair fleet that attacks Gondor during the War of the Ring is described as black-sailed, but on this map, Tolkien says that the Corsairs also used red sails, which contained either a black star or eye. The eye is self-explanatory, it's Sauron's emblem. The black star, on the other hand, isn't explained. You might notice that it's the opposite of the white star that the Númenóreans and probably later Gondorian ships used. This might tell us that the black star was the emblem of the Black Númenóreans, or alternatively, it was the emblem of the Corsairs who descended from Castamir who established a rival state in Umbar. It might have been their way of representing themselves as a rival heir to Númenor and later Gondor. Alternatively, it could just be mocking Gondor's white star. The last thing I want to talk about is latitude. Yes, latitude. As you can see, on this map, Tolkien explains how the latitude of certain locations in Middle-earth compared to places in our own world. Remember, Middle-earth and our world are supposed to be the same planet, so mathematically everything is the same. Tolkien writes that Hobbiton is supposed to be at the same latitude as Oxford in the south of England, that Minas Tirith is supposed to be equal to Ravenna in Italy or Belgrade in Serbia, and that Umbar is supposed to be around the latitude of Cyprus. He explains that you can use these measurements to roughly judge the climate and the flora and fauna of these places. The latitude comparison to our own world is kind of amusing because different places at the same latitude will have completely different climates. Tolkien imagined the Shire as the south of England, fair enough, but the south of England also has the same latitude as much of Canada and parts of Siberia. Oxford and the Shire don't really have brutal winters, whereas Siberia and Canada are renowned for it. Likewise, Minas Tirith or Ravenna and Umbar, or Cyprus, are not as far south as you might think. What this tells us is that Arda as a whole is possibly warmer than our planet right now, or that the Westlands are affected by something similar to the Gulf Stream. But regardless, the latitude stuff is fairly interesting because, like Tolkien said, it helps us imagine the climate in certain places. It's common knowledge that rural England inspired the Shire, but I don't think a lot of people necessarily see Gondor as having something equivalent to a Mediterranean or Balkan climate. As for Umbar, while a Mediterranean climate isn't really surprising, what is more surprising is that Umbar is still absolutely nowhere near Arda's equator. You could fit an entire Westlands again in the south before you actually reach it. It helps you understand just how large Middle-earth is and just how much of it we don't know about. And that's pretty much it in regards to the interesting stuff. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you want more insights into Tolkien's map, you'll have to find a way to contact his ghost or something, but be warned, he'll probably just tell you about languages or trees instead. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I wonder if any elf just decided to row a canoe into the west.